Have you ever wondered why the vast, sun-soaked coast of Texas, stretching from the gentle waves of the Gulf all the way to the Louisiana line, doesn't host a marquee beach town city that rivals the likes of Miami or Los Angeles? You may feel that odd if you've driven that shoreline, sampled its seafood, watched ships pass by, and asked yourself, why isn't there a major city right here on the coast? Today, I'm going to uncover exactly that. You'll discover how geography, climate, history, and economics aligned in unexpected ways, and how despite millions of people living in the region, no coastal city on the Texas Gulf has quite grown into a dominant, standalone metropolis. I've done deep digging into terrain maps, settlement patterns, and industrial development, and I'll show you the real forces behind what's happening. By the end of this video, you'll understand how features like wetlands and barrier islands, powerful storms, and industry-driven growth shaped the coast. You'll see why the perfect spot for a major city might have actually been pulled inland instead. Sit tight, because we're going to pull back the curtain on a coastline that looks inviting, but tells a very different story once you dig into it. Physical geography. The coast that fights back. Stretching from the Louisiana border to the southern tip of Padre Island, the Texas Gulf Coast appears wide, calm, and endlessly inviting. But beneath that serene surface lies one of the most complex and defiant landscapes in the United States. The coast may look like a perfect setting for massive beachfront cities, yet its geography quietly works against that idea at every turn, where the ground itself dares you to build. The first challenge begins with the land itself. The Texas Gulf Coast is part of the vast coastal plain, a region that slopes ever so gently toward the sea. This almost imperceptible descent means water doesn't drain quickly, leaving large areas saturated and flood-prone. The soil, made of layered clays, sand, and silt from millions of years of river deposits, is soft and unstable. For heavy construction, it shifts and settles unevenly, turning the dream of skyscrapers and dense infrastructure into a costly engineering problem moving closer to the shore. The land fragments into a maze of bays, wetlands, and barrier islands. From Galveston to Mustang to Padre Island, these narrow strips of sand act as natural shields against the open Gulf. They constantly reshape under wind, tide, and current, eroding, rebuilding, and shifting with each passing storm season. What looks like solid land today might be gone tomorrow, replaced by a channel of shallow water or a new dune field. That instability keeps permanent urban development difficult and unpredictable. Behind those islands lie extensive lagoons and marshes, places teeming with wildlife but difficult for settlement. They flood easily during high tides and become impassable during storms. Natural deep-water harbors are rare here, unlike along the Atlantic or Pacific coasts, where cities like New York or San Francisco grew around naturally protected bays. Texas's coastline, instead, presents long stretches of shallow water and muddy bottoms that make large-scale maritime construction expensive and risky, where nature draws its own boundaries in salt and clay. The combination of low elevation, limited drainage, and unstable sediment creates a natural defense mechanism against heavy development. It's as if the land itself pushes back whenever people try to reshape it. Add to that the constant influence of the Gulf, the salt spray that corrodes metal, the humid air that wears down buildings, and the tides that chew away at the shore. And the picture becomes clear. This coast is beautiful, but relentless, offering both opportunity and resistance in equal measure. The Texas Gulf Coast isn't a blank canvas for city builders. It's a living system that changes every day. While some communities have adapted, building small, resilient towns or industrial ports behind protective barriers, the geography still decides the limits. It's the quiet, powerful force that explains why no massive metropolis ever took root directly on this ever-moving edge of land and sea. Climate and natural threats. Nature's warning signs. If the Texas Gulf Coast's geography sets the stage, its climate delivers the performance. A powerful, unpredictable one that reminds everyone who truly runs this coastline. The air here carries a dense humidity that never seems to lift, wrapping around everything from dawn to dusk. The salty breeze might feel pleasant for a moment, but it hides the truth of a region constantly tested by heat, water, and wind. For most of the year, temperatures stay warm, often pushing well beyond comfort during the long summer months. The Gulf of Mexico acts as both a heater and a humidifier, trapping moisture that feeds heavy thunderstorms and tropical systems. It creates a unique weather rhythm. Quiet mornings, intense afternoon storms, and humid nights that rarely cool down. This near-constant dampness erodes building materials, wears down infrastructure, and creates living conditions that test even the most resilient residents. Where paradise and peril share the same tide. When people imagine coastal life, they often picture calm blue water and endless sunshine. The Texas Gulf Coast tells a different story. Every few months, the same waters that sparkle under the sun can turn violent, spawning tropical storms or full-scale hurricanes that reshape entire communities. Coastal cities like Galveston, Corpus Christi, and Port Arthur have felt nature's power firsthand through storm surges that flood miles inland, wiping away homes and roads in ours even smaller systems. Those that never earn a name can bring enough rainfall to transform streets into rivers. The Gulf's flat terrain amplifies the danger. With little elevation to slow the water, storm surges travel fast and far. A strong hurricane can push walls of water more than 20 miles inland, flooding areas that seem far from the beach. Unlike other coasts with cliffs or high dunes, the Texas shoreline offers little natural protection. Every time a storm approaches, people move inland, proving once again that large, permanent populations near the open Gulf face constant risk. Beyond the dramatic events, daily life along the coast faces subtler threats. Salt in the air corrodes metal structures, turning bridges and railings to rust faster than anywhere else in the country. The heat combines with humidity to create a near year-round breeding ground for mold, mosquitoes, and decay. The same climate that nourishes lush marshlands makes human comfort harder to maintain. For agriculture, the saline soil and frequent flooding make traditional farming nearly impossible, further limiting the region's potential to support a large inland economy, where every calm horizon remembers the storm. The coast's natural beauty masks its constant volatility. Every sunset over the Gulf hides the memory of the last hurricane and the anticipation of the next. Over the decades, residents have adapted, raising homes on stilts, building seawalls, and designing drainage systems that seem almost futuristic. Yet, no matter how much concrete is poured or how high a wall stands, the Gulf always finds a way to remind people of its strength. This unpredictable dance between land, air, and sea has shaped not only the coastline, but also the human story along it. The very forces that make the Gulf so breathtaking are the same ones that keep its biggest dreams just out of reach. While other regions build upward, the Texas coast is forced to build wiser, a place where every sunrise is both an invitation and a warning from nature itself. Historical development. When settlers looked inland. Long before the oil refineries, highways, and glass towers of modern Texas, the Gulf Coast was already shaping the story of where people would live and how they would survive. When the first European explorers arrived, they saw the same broad stretches of flat land and shining water that we see today. But what they also saw was danger. The early Spanish expeditions along the Gulf reported storms so fierce that ships were lost within sight of the shore. Settlers who tried to build close to the coast found themselves surrounded by swamps, mosquitoes, and floods that could wipe out months of labor overnight. Yet, there was one place that seemed to defy the odds: Galveston. Positioned on a barrier island with access to deep water, Galveston quickly became one of the busiest ports on the Gulf in the 19th century. It was called the Wall Street of the South, a glittering hub of trade and commerce that rivaled any city in the region. Ships from around the world docked there, unloading goods from Europe, the Caribbean, and South America. Elegant homes rose along the waterfront. Banks and theaters flourished, and for a brief moment, it looked as if Galveston would become Texas's great coastal metropolis. The night the sea rewrote Texas history. That dream ended in a single night of destruction. When a massive hurricane swept across the island, it left behind devastation so complete that it changed the trajectory of the entire state. Thousands of lives were lost. The city's economy was shattered, and investors turned away from the open Gulf forever. The storm's impact reached far beyond Galveston. It redefined where Texans believed it was safe to build. It was nature's way of underlining the lesson geography had already begun teaching. The closer to the water, the greater the risk. In the aftermath, attention shifted inland to Houston. Though smaller at the time, Houston sat far enough from the Gulf to avoid the worst of the storms, but close enough to benefit from its trade routes. When the Houston Ship Channel was dredged to connect the city directly to the Gulf, it gave Houston all the advantages of a coastal city without the same vulnerability. What Galveston lost, Houston gained, and the state's urban focus moved decisively inland. Elsewhere along the Texas coast, settlements followed similar patterns. Places like Corpus Christi, Port Arthur, and Beaumont became vital for shipping and industry, but never evolved into sprawling metropolitan centers. Their economies were tied to oil, gas, and maritime trade, not the kind of diversified development that sustains major cities. Residents lived close enough to the coast to work, yet far enough inland to rebuild quickly after each storm. The result was a chain of smaller, resilient towns, rather than one dominating coastal giant. Even today, the legacy of those early choices is visible. Roads, railways, and pipelines all lead from the interior to the shore, not the other way around. Texas grew with its back to the Gulf, using it as a resource rather than a home. When settlers looked inland, they found safety, stability, and room to expand. Those same decisions still shape where people live now. A reminder that history on the Texas coast has always been written by the push and pull between ambition and survival. Economics and infrastructure. Where industry rules, not residency. As Texas entered the modern age, the Gulf Coast transformed once again. But this time, the story wasn't about settlers or storms. It was about power, pipelines, and production. While other states built coastal skylines filled with condos and boardwalks, Texas built something entirely different. One of the most industrialized coastlines on Earth. The Gulf didn't become a place to live. It became a place to work. When black gold met the restless tide. The discovery of oil and gas in the early 20th century changed everything. Refineries, chemical plants, and shipping terminals began to rise along the shoreline from Houston to Corpus Christi. Towns that once survived on fishing and small-scale trade suddenly found themselves at the center of an energy empire. The coast's flat land, deep ports, and easy access to the Gulf made it ideal for industrial use. But while the industry brought wealth to Texas, it also reshaped the land in a way that discouraged residential growth. The same zones that made sense for refineries, low, isolated, and close to shipping lanes, were the worst places to build large neighborhoods or downtown districts. Over time, these industries took full control of the coast. Long stretches of shoreline became dominated by factories, pipelines, and storage tanks. The air carried the sharp scent of petroleum, and the horizon filled with stacks of steam and flame. While these sites signaled economic strength, they also turned the coast into a working landscape. Rather than a livable one, people moved inland to cleaner, quieter areas, leaving the waterfront to the industries that depended on it. The infrastructure followed the same pattern. Highways, rail lines, and ports were designed to move materials efficiently, not to connect communities. The Port of Houston became one of the busiest in the nation, handling billions of dollars in cargo each year. Yet the neighborhoods nearby remained modest and industrial. The focus was always on productivity, not population. The Texas Gulf evolved into an engine room for the state's economy, feeding the world's demand for energy and manufacturing, but without the urban sprawl seen along the coasts of California or Florida. That divide between industry and residency created a kind of invisible border. The coast hummed with machines, cranes, and tankers, while the people who kept it running lived miles inland. Coastal towns like Port Arthur, Freeport, and Baytown became defined not by tourism or downtown skylines, but by the rhythm of shift changes and refinery lights flickering across the night sky. It was prosperity, but not the kind that drew crowds of new residents or luxury developers. Where ambition built an empire instead of a skyline, the Texas Gulf Coast succeeded in ways few expected. It became essential to the nation's energy supply, a global shipping hub, and a cornerstone of American infrastructure. Yet, in achieving that success, it traded the idea of being a residential paradise for the reality of being a powerhouse. The coast didn't fail to grow. It grew differently. It became a region where the hum of engines replaced the hum of city life, proving that sometimes economic strength doesn't build a skyline. It builds an empire just beyond the shore. Modern urban logic. Houston's shadow. When people picture the Texas Gulf Coast, one city inevitably dominates the conversation: Houston. Yet, what makes Houston so fascinating is that it's not truly on the coast at all. It sits roughly 50 miles inland, surrounded by bayous instead of beaches, and yet it functions as the region's de facto coastal capital. Key, that choice to build inland rather than on the water's edge wasn't accidental. It was the product of deliberate, long-term logic, shaped by both human foresight and environmental reality. The city that bent geography to its will. Houston's founders understood what the early coastal settlements learned the hard way. Safety and growth depend on distance from the sea. By positioning the city just far enough inland to avoid the Gulf's worst floods and storms, Houston secured a balance that no other coastal community could replicate. Its engineers solved the one problem that limited coastal cities: access to deep water. By building it themselves, the Houston Ship Channel carved a direct path from the city to the Gulf, transforming a swampy inland plain into one of the world's busiest ports. It was an audacious act of geography re-engineering, allowing Houston to enjoy the economic advantages of a port city without the constant threat of destruction. Once the ship channel opened, Houston's rise became unstoppable. Industries that once might have settled along the open coast moved to the city's outskirts, gaining protection from hurricanes while maintaining maritime access. Highways, railways, and pipelines radiated outward from Houston like veins of a living system, feeding resources to and from the coast with astonishing efficiency. As refineries and shipping terminals grew along the Gulf, Houston's downtown rose upward, powered by the wealth those industries created. Over time, Houston became not just the largest city in Texas, but the anchor that overshadowed every other Gulf settlement. Its massive metropolitan footprint absorbed nearby towns, pulling economic activity and population toward its orbit. While places like Galveston, Corpus Christi, and Beaumont continued to play important roles, they could never match the scale or resilience of Houston's inland position. It became the safe harbor behind the storm wall, the city that benefited from the coast while avoiding its dangers. One city inland, one coast at the edge of risk. This pattern reveals something fundamental about modern urban logic in the region. The Texas Gulf Coast doesn't need a major city directly on the shoreline, because Houston already fulfills that role indirectly. Its influence extends all the way to the barrier islands, shaping trade, industry, and infrastructure from a distance. The coast provides the gateway. Houston provides the control center. Together, they operate as one interconnected system where one thrives on stability while the other braves the elements. In a way, Houston's shadow protects the Gulf itself. It absorbs the population pressure that might otherwise fill fragile coastal zones with sprawling development. It gives Texas the economic might of a coastal metropolis, while preserving the coast's rugged natural character. Every skyline view, every shipping container, every flickering refinery light along the Gulf ultimately traces back to that inland powerhouse. Houston didn't just grow near the coast. It redefined what it means to be a coastal city without ever touching the waves. The human factor: comfort, cost, and culture. For all the maps, models, and historical forces that shape the Texas Gulf Coast, the final reason there are no major cities along its edge comes down to something deeply human: the daily experience of living there. The coast has its beauty, but it also has its burdens. Life near the open Gulf is a constant negotiation between comfort and cost, a lifestyle that rewards toughness more than convenience. The weather sets the tone for everything. Summer arrives early and leaves late, bringing with it a thick humidity that clings to every surface. The air can feel almost liquid, turning simple tasks into exhausting efforts. The heat index regularly soars high enough to make even short walks outdoors feel like endurance tests. Air conditioning isn't a luxury here, it's survival. Yet that relief comes with a price: higher energy bills, constant maintenance, and the unshakable feeling that the climate dictates your routine. Then there's the cost of protection. Insurance rates along the coast are some of the highest in the state. Not because of what happens every year, but because of what could happen any year. Storm risk drives up property values in unexpected ways, not from luxury demand, but from the expense of safeguarding what you already own. Building codes require elevated homes, reinforced roofs, and flood-resistant materials, which make coastal living expensive long before you even move in. The farther inland you go, the more affordable it gets, a pattern that naturally pushes families, businesses, and entire communities away from the open water, where the sea builds character, not vacation homes. Culturally, the Texas coast has always been more working shore than resort strip. The people who live there tend to see the ocean not as a playground, but as a partner, sometimes generous, sometimes unforgiving. Fishing, shipping, and energy have shaped the local identity for generations, creating a population proud of its grit and resilience. Yet, that same working spirit has also meant fewer luxury developments and less emphasis on tourism-driven growth compared to other coastal states. Visitors might come for the beaches of South Padre or the historic charm of Galveston, but most Texans return inland to where life feels more stable, predictable, and economically balanced. Even the rhythm of life is different. On the coast, every decision, from construction to vacation planning, revolves around weather forecasts and storm tracks. The possibility of evacuation lingers in the back of people's minds, influencing where they invest, where they raise families, and how they define security. For many, the dream of coastal living fades after facing the reality of one powerful storm or one flooded season. Yet, the people who remain wouldn't trade it for anywhere else. They understand that living by the Gulf means living with the Gulf. There's pride in enduring its moods, a quiet duoyance that echoes through the docks, the shipyards, and the small coastal towns that refuse to disappear. The Texas Gulf Coast isn't a place of comfort or convenience. It's a place of persistence. That human resilience is what keeps it alive, even if it never becomes home to the kind of sprawling metropolis that defines other shores. The coast that could be. The Texas Gulf Coast stretches for hundreds of miles, a ribbon of wetlands, dunes, and open water that feels timeless yet untamed. It's easy to imagine what could have been. A skyline rising over the waves, a coastal capital glowing under the Gulf sunset, but history and nature agreed on a different outcome. Every force that could have built a great city here instead pulled it just out of reach. Geography shaped the boundaries, storms carved the memory, and human logic made the final choice. The unseen city that lives between land and tide. The coast remains the state's working frontier, vital, resilient, but rarely celebrated. It hums with the sound of engines and waves, where oil refineries meet fishing boats and cranes stretch over the marshland horizon. Each part of it serves a purpose, yet no single city claims its identity. Houston became the brain, Galveston the heart, and countless smaller towns the hands that keep the entire region alive. Together, they form a network that functions like one great invisible city, stretched along the Gulf but built just far enough inland to survive its tempers. There's something poetic about that restraint. The Texas Gulf Coast could have been another Miami or Los Angeles, but instead, it became something entirely its own. Quieter, stronger, and more enduring. Its towns rise not for glamour, but for grit, built by people who respect the ocean's beauty while knowing its cost. Every storm that rolls through reminds residents that progress here isn't about conquering nature, but learning to coexist with it. Maybe that's the real story. Not why there are no major cities along the Texas coast, but why that absence matters. It's what keeps the shoreline wild, the marshes alive, and the Gulf's horizon open from the shipyards of Port Arthur to the calm beaches of South Padre. The coast stands as proof that growth doesn't always mean skyscrapers. Sometimes it means understanding when to stay close enough to benefit, but far enough to endure. So the next time you drive toward the Gulf and see that endless flat horizon stretching into the sea, remember that it isn't empty. It's intentional. The Texas coast isn't a failed experiment. It's a living compromise between ambition and respect for nature. Its story isn't finished. Either from tomorrow or the next decade, the same question will remain. Will humanity ever tame this coast? Or will it always belong to the Gulf itself?